welcome to an episode of What a Hell Way to Die. No Francis intro, no nothing. It's just me. Well, it's me and also the full cast of the Lions Led by Donkeys podcast, which includes me now because I have Joe Kasabian and Thomas O'Mahony. I think I said it wrong, but I always say it wrong. Irish Tom, for those of you who cannot fucking say it correctly like me.
An attempt was made.
And an attempt was made out of respect, and it's better than my previous attempts. I'm trying. I'm really trying.
Slowly getting better.
But we are here. We are all in London, or rather, we're all on London time. Joe is not in London at all. He's in Armenia. Tom is elsewhere in London. And actually, you're not on London time, so I don't know what the hell I'm talking about, Joe.
Hey, close enough.
You're basically British for this hour.
It's the meanest thing you've ever said to me.
Yeah,
British Joe is a terrible vibe.
Yeah, it's yeah. When he becomes a British citizen, he has to change the spelling of his last name to have one S to be like the band.
Hell yeah, representing the Manson family, baby.
I don't actually know any Kasabian songs. I've just seen them around, and I've seen their the folder for Kasabian albums on like FTP servers in the mid 2000s when I was pirating music. But I actually didn't even know they were British until relatively recently. They are British,
honestly,
right?
I think
honestly,
so.
A great band if you're absolutely shithouse drunk in a pub and one of like Club Foot comes on, then it's a vibe. It's a bit like Oasis.
Yeah, I mean, that's a whole thing. We've talked about it on Britanology before, but that just like, there are definitely songs that you just play in bars on jukeboxes in America, but in Britain there's more of, and I presume there's a similar tendency in Ireland of just like there's certain standards in pubs that everyone sings along to.
Yeah, 100%. Like a couple of years ago, I went to, it was Tradfest, so different type of Tradfest. There wasn't loads of
let's hope.
Not a lot of people defenestrating and committing acts of self-mutilation. But no, it's like traditional music, and my partner's father is a very well-known Irish musician and was playing it, and one of my friends who's Australian came along, and like everyone was singing along, and he just goes, does everyone just know all of these songs? And I was like, yeah, pretty much.
Yeah, it's like if you've been drinking in pubs since you were a teenager, which most of these people have, like they've just heard them all the time. It's like, just by virtue of being exposed to British culture, on TV or otherwise, I became familiar with the song "Is This the Way to Amarillo," which I don't know if you know, Joe, but it's one of those sort of, I don't know if it's a pub standard, but it's definitely one of those like songs people know. It was used in like a TV sketch that got like very imitated as viral videos.
Yeah, Peter Kay.
Yeah, people just know that song. Similarly, not only is Sweet Caroline one of those standards, I came downstairs to set up the recording, and I guess Milo was doing some kind of composition involving Sweet Caroline because all of like the chords to Sweet Caroline and fucking music software was open, and it's like that's the hold that it's got on Brits. That Milo, who was born in 1993, is like, no, I'm gonna do something with Sweet Caroline.
I say
sweet poisoned mind. Your tweets never were so good.
I feel very comfortable saying that I know the least about music than any of us in our group, and I only knew about the band Kasabian because people would be like, Kasabian, like the band. I was like, what?
Love Kasabian, ate the boats. Enough said.
I mean, it's named after Linda Kasabian of the Manson family, and previous to the band being a thing, they'd be like, oh, Kasabian, like the Manson family. So I'm glad this has evolved over time.
It's an improvement. Yeah, so there have been guys in American football with the last name Bethea, sometimes said Bethea. Antoine Bethea was the running back for the Colts when they won the Super Bowl, but definitely when they had their like almost undefeated season in 05-06. And so that was like a good point of like people at least kind of understanding how to say my last name. Because like in the era of like always getting landline telemarketer calls, we would get like Bethia, stuff like that. And prior to, there were a couple others, but the one that people knew back in the 2000s was Antoine Bethea. The only really famous person named Bethea was a guy named Rainey Bethea, who was the last publicly executed person in America. So, like kind of a similar vibe. Although that was like a real Wikipedia deep dive. There's a ratio of about, let's say, 10-1. If you have the last name Bethea in America, you're probably black versus being white. And white Betheas love to come up with complete bullshit stories of why they think that is. They're like, oh, well, there was a doctor who delivered babies on plantations and the slaves all kept his last name after emancipation. It's like, yeah, that's definitely what happened.
That's going to press B for doubt on that one, homie.
Yeah, I definitely think that's what happened, and not the very obvious thing that we all know what it was, considering my dad's family were fucking Huguenots who the King James fucking repaid his insane gambling debts by granting them tracts of land in the Carolinas. And it's like, what do you think they did? It's like, we're a bunch of French and Dutch people living in England in exile, and now we're going to move to North and South Carolina. We're going to grow indigo. Do you think we have the constitution to do this labor and not immediately die from the sun? What do you think happened? Come on. So yeah, the name game is always an interesting one for me. I don't know, Thomas. What do you have any Irish surname lore for you?
No. So like,
no,
essentially what there is like, there is two versions of my surname. There's one with an E and without an E. So like a lot of people in the US who technically have the same name as me, it's pronounced O'Mahony. Like if you think of like a fat Boston cop is probably called O'Mahony.
And the bar he drinks in and it says even more racist shit and is also called O'Mahony's.
Yeah, exactly.
It's O'Mahony's like, all the way down.
Yeah. But like it's pretty much that. It's like that's pretty much it. The weird thing is that like technically I have a Roman numeral after my name, but that's another story.
Which Roman digit are you?
Number 3.
Number 3. Yeah, there wasn't no one in my family has ever done any name continuity. My granddad was John David and my dad was David Keith, but my granddad went by David and my dad goes by Keith. So, but my middle name is Bradley and no one ever called me that unless they were saying my full name because I was getting in trouble as a kid.
If only it was the other way around, he could have been the arbiter.
David Keith or Keith David, right, yeah. Milo and I were laughing because his parents are sadly passed away, but his dad's name was Keith and his mom's name was Sue and my mom's name is Sonia, so we're not that far off. But my mom also, had she stayed in Norfolk where she was born, would have been, I can only imagine. But instead she moved to America with her American airman dad who basically tried to bail on his family, and he told his family like, hey, don't worry, this is just the way the protocol works with the US Air Force, like they'll definitely notify you when you can move to America. And he almost got away with it, but they called his base commander and they were like, he's like, no, this guy's fucking full of shit. He's completely running out on you and we're gonna get his ass. And so he had to bring his family to America, and then they stayed married unhappily for like forever until they both died. So my grandmother was 16 when my mom was born. My grandfather was like 20. So problematic age gap discourse begins.
Air Force tradition, military tradition, honestly.
Yeah.
If
definitely.
only it was a couple of decades later, he could have got the shit kicked out of him by a couple of teens.
Yeah, I was going to say he would be on a viral TikTok called Nonce Hunters or something like that. Yeah. Yeah, although to be fair, 16 is technically legal in Britain. And that's not a line of argument I want to open up, but like that is just what the law is here. Like it is slightly like there was a tweet years ago from a guy Ben from Bunta Vista, is at Thomas Violence. He's a very, very funny dude. He was one of our guests when we did our live show in Brisbane. And there was some comment, I can't remember what it was, that someone said to him, very sort of Americanly corrected him on something. And he's like, oh, my apologies. I'm one of the dozens and dozens of people on the planet that aren't American. And
I always remember laughing because there was a period of time where like his display name was Mr. Piece of Shit.
Oh, no, I think that was, maybe they shared it. I think that was Andrew, actually.
Oh, yeah,
but Mr.
Right.
Piece of Shit. I was thinking about Mr. Piece of Shit while I was riding my bike home. Mr. Piece of Shit, Mr. Going on the Computer. Like, yeah, they were both really good.
That they should update the Mr. Men to Mr. Piece of Shit, Mr. Going on the Computer.
Yeah, well, I mean, I feel like Mr. Going on the Computer becoming Mr. Piece of Shit is a trajectory that we're all very familiar with.
I always heard it in the tune of like, that song Mr. Steal Your Girl, but it's Mr. Piece of Shit, which is why I think I laughed so hard at it.
Yeah, I mean, there's something very funny about being Mr. Stupid Name. I don't know why the Mr. makes it funnier, but it absolutely does. And I'm not gonna transgress against biological law here when it comes to jokes.
Sorry, you can call me Piece of Shit. My father was Mr. Piece of Shit.
That's right.
So, speaking of biological law,
oh no, I don't like
there's
this
some
segue.
really dumb, yeah, there's some really dumb shit
in
happening
the UK
in
too long.
I know, right? And so, yeah, there was some news lately, and I wanted to talk to you guys about it because I was thinking of bringing my buddy Ross on, but then I was like, you know what? Actually, I'm gonna let Ross have a bit of a rest on this one because I think it's very unfair to bring your trans friend on to be like, hey, let's talk about how Britain wants to do like fucking, horrible, just. Joe, you're the expert. I don't know if genocide is the right answer here, but basically they want to legislate being trans out of existence.
I would say that word is apt. Yes.
Yeah, and so effectively, what they're doing now is they're effectively trying to come up with this new sort of. They apply a new standard. It's been leaked about what the laws or guidelines are going to be for teachers in schools and as regards students, and it's pretty fucking grim. So basically what they're saying is you will be obligated as a teacher to tell parents if a child confides in you that they are questioning their gender identity. And they will also will be legally required to tell your parents if you want to go by another name or if you want to wear a different gender uniform. The school will not be allowed to use your preferred pronouns or name unless your parents give consent. Your teachers will be ordered to not recognize a gender transition unless the parents have given consent. So you will be barred from coming to school presenting as your chosen identity if your parents haven't given express consent. Basically, neither teachers nor students will be required to use your name or pronouns if they don't want to. And basically, they are also, it seems to me like trying to mean that even if your parents do consent, that the school is basically obligated to then give your parents like a safety briefing about how they're irreparably damaging their child by letting them transition.
So one of the things that sticks out to me is I think a lot of people know I used to be a high school teacher in the United States. And in the United States, you are a mandatory reporter for suspected child abuse, and it's very obvious that for people unaware, mandatory reporter means you are bound by law to report it as soon as you see it. Like you have no choice. If you do not report these things, you can go to prison. At minimum, you'll lose your job. And it's very obvious that I'm assuming this is in the UK, and I'm assuming the UK teachers are also mandatory reporters for child abuse.
Pretty sure they are, yeah.
So they're attempting to frame a child questioning their gender identity or identifying as something other than what their parents or teachers see them as child abuse. That is what they're framing this as, which is fucking insane.
And it's weird too because like there's been so much hysteria in the press. I mean, like effectively we just have this right-wing propaganda machine runs everything in this country in terms of how people get information. But it's also strange too because like, I've seen things polling basically suggesting that like something around half of Brits don't think that trans people deserve additional rights. A similar number thinks accommodations for trans people have gone too far. But then you'll also see things like, all of the apps changing their displays to like the pride flag, including the trans symbol, sort of identifiers. And even my local council is flying that flag. I'm just like, in a way, I'm like, why are you flying that flag? Like, you fucking hate trans people. Everything about this state hates trans people. Like, why are you even playing like in a way it's insulting? It's like, and so you see this stuff happening that like, it's been like this nonstop assault and just like kind of browbeating people where the only time you ever hear it discussed is in a way where it allows it to amplify the most deranged hardline views, always in opposition to any accommodation of trans people. And then, and then they're like, oh yeah, by the way, the God's law has determined that all Brits are in agreement that this it's good to be as abusive and unaccommodating as possible. And it's like, well, I wonder how that happened.
But like, it's so weird in like seeing the reaction both in the US and the UK, and like it's happening a little bit in Ireland now, like the kind of fucking the trans version of a Red Scare, pretty much. And like in the UK, it seems like you do have two branches. You have like the religious branch of it that's like it's not as kind of insane as the evangelical side in the US, but it still does have that religious tint to it. And then you have like the state side where it's like, oh, these people are essentially fucking aberrations to society and we shouldn't accommodate them any more than we already have. This is a danger to the children. And it's always like in Ireland, I think it was last week, there was this group of shower cunts who were like protesting a library who they had books in stock that were like informative for kids about, queer issues and that sort of thing. And they were there, and the library is technically on private property because the building is owned privately, but the library is operated by the state. And like they were like screaming and harassing people like that were just trying to go to their apartment and everything. Like, oh, do you support this? Do you support this? And it was like, do you know what? Do you know what we need to do? We need to get. I'm gonna bleep that out, but.
Well, in America, it's interesting because there was a period of time when, and I never believed it and never trusted it, when people would be like, wow, why is Britain so much worse than America on this? And what I find interesting about it is that I never thought that would last. Just knowing America and knowing how, growing up in the 90s and 2000s and seeing how even the slightest step forward towards, cis gay rights was treated with such incredible backlash and then was weaponized by right-wing politicians.
But I think in a large part, and it's something that obviously I'm much younger, well, not much younger, but I'm younger than you guys, and like seeing how many people who are like would technically be members of the queer community like willfully pulling the ladder up behind them and saying like, oh no, well, we need to, like, being a lesbian or being gay or whatever is like, that's normal, but being trans is. And I saw a meme on Twitter, it was like, oh my god, no, the Straggots are now trying to include gays and lesbians into being straight.
Yeah, what gets me about I saw one time, it was really funny. There was an acrostic and it was just like a thing on, I think it was on Instagram, where someone had made like a sort of like rainbow gradient, and it was like, yeah, I'm queer, and it was like spelling it, QUERE, like it was going to spell out some kind of an acronym, and it just said straight. But I think the thing for me though is I knew that America would turn this way, but I think the linchpin of the trans panic in America is they're mutilating our kids. They're trying to force shit on kids. They're sexualizing kids. Whereas in Britain, that is not the line of argument. Like Lawrence Fox and like the real like sort of joined at the hip fascist online freaks.
I'm sorry, Nate. I need to talk about this. It's you brought up Lawrence Fox. You know the way it was Father's Day yesterday?
Yep. And he's the world's most divorced man.
Do you want to know who Lawrence Fox spent Father's Day with?
Who?
Graham Linehan and that weird priest.
Oh, Calvin Robinson or whatever. Yeah. And they were like burning trans flags or burning pride flags. Yeah, fucking psycho. That's really ominous and scary, but also it's like, this is just like when the divorce went badly and no one has intervened with your stimulant habit, we'll call it that. The thing is, though, is that in Britain, the line of argument for all of the headbanger shit was never about children. Fox and those guys like to say that shit because deep down they want to be Americans, and they see how like DeSantis and these fucking all these freaks in America and all of like the sort of like grassroots base of the psychos are going at it. But it was never about protecting children, which I think is kind of revealing in a way. It was always this idea that that adult trans people would use the state accommodations to get access to cis women.
Yeah, because in America, the drum is, won't somebody think of the children,
Yes.
And
in
always
Britain,
works.
the only time people say think of the children, it's like, actually, I think you think of the children a little too much. But like not making light of it too much here. In Britain, like they fucking hate kids in this country.
Yeah, they do, they generally.
Hate children
like
so
it's
much.
That screenshot from that Channel 4 documentary that goes around like at least once every 2 weeks, where it's that kid saying, I try not to eat too much every day. And I'm just like, that surmises like Britain in a nutshell.
It seems like, the UK has a particular like loathing towards their own youth, while Americans see their children as their own personal belongings with no freedom of their own.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I could never really nail down what the counter argument, or rather the sort of the American version of this is, because Americans, in my opinion, don't hate their children, but America is this incredibly atomizing society that if you live outside of a few exceptions, particularly if you're white and you live in suburbs, is designed to make you hate everyone else, that every other person in the world is a threat, is an inconvenience.
And I think the fundamental difference between the US and the UK is like, it's a kind of, if you look at this from a Marxist analyst or just like even a material analyst, is that like American society is fundamentally based on property, whereas UK is fundamentally built on productivity. So like,
I actually kind of disagree with you. I think Britain is built on the supremacy of property above all else, and America is built on the supremacy of racial hierarchy above all else. And so America, for example, is more than happy to tolerate vigilantism and a lot of destruction of property so long as it keeps the racial hierarchy in place, whereas in Britain, it has to be that the law exists to protect the property so that the slum and the fucking country house can be right next to one another, and no one can ever intervene, and no one can ever question or materially affect the fact that this is allowed to exist.
Yeah,
And
well, I agree with that. I mean more so as like, say, parents or like members of the public relate to young people. It's like Joe said, it's like, you know, parents in the US see their kids as their property, whereas like in the wider public, like in the UK, when you look at like groups of kids, particularly like, say, if you walk around central London, like you'll have people like tut-tutting because there's like kids running around, and like of any kind of race, it does predominantly target like young black British guys, but it's like, oh, they're not being productive members of society. And yeah, there is a dog whistle in that as well, but I think Britain, like, class rules everything in Britain a lot more than race.
Yeah, and it's strange too, because I've talked about this a bunch, and I know I always repeat myself, but in a very kind of like off the cuff, offhand conversation with Hussein via text messages, we were talking about somebody getting mad at someone we knew because they were just sort of doing the thing where they imply that like, I don't like this person, either I disagree with their statements, or I'm angry that they're more popular, more successful in whatever field than I am. So my default reaction is to imply that actually secretly they're posh and they're rich, and that's why they have this advantage. and Hussein was just like, just very, without even, it wasn't like it was a very deliberated upon statement. It was just like, British people love to talk about class and also have no idea what it is.
Yeah, 100%.
And that has been lodged in my brain the whole time, because Britain, I get the argument, and I think there's a certain degree of validity to say that class isn't entirely defined by earnings, money, ownership. That's not the sole factor. But the thing that's so weird about Britain is that they say it's got nothing to do with it. And so all class is just a series of sort of cultural, social markers. And the idea is that you can never transcend, you can never raise or lower. So as a result, Brits are so fixated on their interpretation of what they think class is. The British class system is a separate thing to any other class system. It's like, let me just finish this. That they basically, they have cornered themselves, they've boxed themselves in to believe that they are a working class, multi-property landlord being oppressed by their upper class barista who rents from them.
Like I would kind of, the way I always think about it is like, class in Britain is like being bound with invisible ropes. Like,
it's a caste system. Yeah, that's what I've said over and over again. It's a caste system.
It's a caste system, but like in terms of like people's acknowledgement of it, it's like it is being bound with invisible ropes. Like you are tied to this one particular position, and you can't acknowledge it because you have to pretend you don't see it.
Yeah, and it's also strange too, because maybe you've experienced this, Joe, and maybe you've also experienced this, Tom. I don't know. I know that Brits, English people, will be specific, are very, very like condescending and dismissive towards Irish people in general. But if you're an American in Britain, it's very interesting because, for better or worse, for most of us, outside of like really strong regional accents, it's not as easy to suss out someone's class standing based on how they speak. And also, American class is just different. Like the way we see it is different. The way it's kind of enforced is different. And the only place that really replicates the British class system is like New England. And even then, it's like a weird kind of amalgamation of things. And a lot of it is like trapped in amber notions from the 19th century. Sort of the same, like WASPs in New England are the British upper middle class and upper class equivalent of like, you know, my family's from the old country, and it's like you've lived in Secaucus, New Jersey for like 5 generations, but you're still Italian somehow.
Yeah, it's socioeconomic cosplay. That's all it is.
But I guess the thing I'd say though is that Brits can't suss out what our class standing is from our accents. And so there's lots and lots of probing questions that they think they're being slick about, and they're not.
Oh, yeah.
Trying to figure out where you fit on their pyramid, their hierarchy, their ladder, in order to sort of like, oh, well, then I can assess this person and sort of, know my enemy in a sense, even in a friendly way.
I have had that experience, and I was only in the UK for a week, but I run into British people pretty frequently here in Armenia, and they do tend to do the same thing, even though they're out of their element. More so than probably anybody else that I've run into around the world.
Like, Joe, actually, as a question, like from, being in the UK and then being in Ireland in like very short succession, like how was that experience different? Because I kind of think that like Irish people, like in general, like in just general interaction, don't really care about that stuff, which from now living in the UK is like, it was actually a shock to me when I moved.
Yeah, I didn't have any situations like that come up at all in Ireland. People seemed much more happy to, just make small talk, didn't really care about where you're from or what you do. Whereas in the UK, that was like the first thing that would come up, is trying to figure out where I would fall on this, imaginary caste system that I have no part of as a foreigner.
Yeah, that's something that I found like really shocking, is like, even if you're talking to someone in the pub, like, within the first 3 questions, they're going to ask you what you do for a living. Whereas in Ireland, like, you could be sitting at a bar, and like, this isn't to say that like Ireland's perfect and Ireland's great, but like, you could talk to someone for like 2-3 hours and it just not come up.
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, I think Americans don't have the same pub/bar experiences that people in Britain and Ireland do. But the thing I like in it too is sitting on a plane. If you talk to someone next to you on a plane, like, it's weird to ask them what their name is, and it's weird to ask them what they do for a living. So like, you just talk about whatever you're talking, if you choose to talk.
If someone talks to me on a plane, the things I will do are unspeakable. Do not interact with me on a plane.
I had the weirdest experience with, like, to quote Fight Club, single serving plane friend.
What was it when you bought the wet sandwich on Wizz Air?
No, because nobody was talking to me then except the stewardess or the flight attendants. I was flying from Hawaii to Armenia, I believe for the second time, and you have to catch a layover in Qatar, and then, I mean, that's the easiest flight path. Otherwise, you can jump through like 8 regional fucking European airports and have it be a nightmare. And I got on my flight from Doha to Yerevan, and I sat next to a Brazilian Jewish family that picked coming to Armenia at random, because this is like when COVID was still a thing, and they were going to Israel, but Israel will not let them go from Brazil to Israel because Israel is considered like a COVID hotspot. So they had to pick a country at random that was not on this list and stay there for 2 weeks so they could go to Israel. And the strangest fucking conversation on earth I had with this guy. Like, he was a gay Brazilian Jew who was a huge fan of Bolsonaro, because this is before the election.
For Israelis.
I was like, man, that doesn't sound right to me, but all right. And like, he went off in like this very broken English about how woke culture was destroying America. And like stuff like that. I was like, this is the strangest conversation with someone on an airplane I've ever had.
Yeah, and it's weird because, like, to bring it back what we were talking about earlier, like, as someone who is like openly a member of the queer community, when I encounter like really conservative like queer people, I'm like, do you think they're going to keep us as their little pets? Like, once they're done with everyone else, do you think they're going to like, oh, they have the same politics as us, they're going to choose us as the good ones?
And that's pretty much what I said in regards to the Glendale school situation last time we recorded. Like, because, the hyper-conservative people think if they become racist and bigoted enough, they'll be accepted as, like, one of them. Like, it doesn't work that way, man.
Yeah. Also, like, look, I'm going to be real with you. When you get into the sort of epistemology of right-wing nativists in America, Armenians are going to be tentatively accepted for the time being, but, like, they don't think Armenian Americans belong.
Yeah, of course they don't.
They're too foreign. They're too foreign.
Yeah, of course not.
And like, that, but like I think a lot of There's a lot of misunderstanding, I think, and there's a lot of self-delusion. Also, I found it really funny. If I'm remembering correctly, Tom made a comment in our group chat where he said, you'd think Armenian Americans would be pro confirmation surgery because then they can finally get a surgeon to make it so their hair can stand up on end like spikes on demand and they can run at you like Sonic the Hedgehog.
We would become unstoppable. Nothing could stop us. I mean, that is the surgery that I'm getting soon.
Yeah, exactly. You have to do that. That's gender confirmation surgery for cis Armenian men.
Like one of the things that bothers me the most is like obviously this doesn't have anything to do with the UK law. But you would think a group of people that had their identity stolen from them for generations would be a little bit more open to someone else embracing their own. I was wrong. That'll show me.
Yeah, I'm just going to spend a couple of grand to get a hair transplant, rather put it on the front of my head. And I'm just going to put it all over the rest of my body so I can finally solidify the Irish and Armenian links.
Yeah, exactly. You basically have a wetsuit of hair, no hair on the top of your head, and a unibrow that looks like a superhighway.
And in order to become more Irish, I'm going to start a tax haven.
Yup.
Yeah, it's funny. I've never been to Ireland other than layovers in the Dublin and Shannon airports, and I'd love to go. And I'm hoping that I either go just to hang out or we go to do live shows. But it is interesting to me because when I'm, for example, outside of England or even, in say like the north of England, not southern England, like you do get the impression that you can encounter people who, some of the things that we're describing, some of the tendencies, like I'll be honest, there's a certain degree of confirmation bias because it's very, very southern English.
Yeah.
And I think that the wealthy parts of southern England are the absolute worst about those tendencies. But then when you look at like what we were talking about previously when we started this segment, talking about transphobia and institutional transphobia, cultural transphobia, and like a lot of the kind of right-wing dog whistles, I think that's universal just because of who runs the media in Britain, which is Rupert Murdoch and, other right-wing billionaires. Basically every news outlet is owned by reactionary billionaires, and the state-owned broadcaster in Britain has slowly but surely been appointing right-wing culture war figures and Tory party grandees in their senior management to basically make concessions to the right, which is always funny because it's the same kind of thing. Like they think the hard right in Britain think that the BBC is, the voice of woke gay communism. Like they will never see the BBC as an ally. God, I know, right? And so, yeah, there is a lot of this kind of, call it accommodating self-delusion that just weirds me out. But I think ultimately the victims here are kids. The victims here are young people who, like you said, are being treated like they're being treated as punitively as possible, as cruelly as possible. And in kind of in the American vein, it's reinforcing this idea that children are the absolute property of their parents.
Yes. Yeah. And I mean, most Americans see their kids as having slightly, I'm not saying all Americans, I'm saying the American parents that would do shit like what we're talking about, see their kids having slightly more rights than like their golden retriever that they have named like a more normal name than their child,
Braylon.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Their son, the golden retriever is named Bobby, but their son is Bradley, Leigh.
They're just like their kids have names like they're the Warhammer 40k characters.
I would at least respect that a little bit more.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you get down to it, though, I'm going to be 39 in September. I'll be 40 next year. Like, I've been sort of politically conscious long enough to see waves of this stuff take place and waves of reaction take place to very, very small gains. And the thing that's interesting is that in Britain, I think some of the gains are actually, they're being eroded. And culturally speaking, I think that the pitch, the tone of the conversation is so much more like universally hostile. Like the New York Times has gradually revealed itself to be pretty fucking transphobic institutionally, and it certainly grants a lot of breadth and latitude to its most like insane idiot people. Like I can't remember the lady off the top of my head, but her ex-husband is Bret Stephens, and apparently when she ran the literary supplement, she would blacklist reviews of books by authors who would criticize her ex-husband because like it's just right-wing fuckfest there. But she's always writing anti-trans and like just asking questions articles. Like, but the thing I would say is that there is pushback, whereas like, and there's favorable coverage, there's sympathetic coverage, whereas in Britain it's almost impossible. Even like the notionally liberal, and I'm not saying leftist, liberal newspapers like The Guardian are uniformly hostile. And
but that's because like there's no such thing as a liberal. You are just a right winger. Like you're like, okay, gay people can exist, but I don't want them, like being too extra. Like I saw this like tweet thread yesterday, and it was like, oh, why do we need to have like, mincing like effeminate benders flowing around the place when we could have people, like positive gay representation like Elton John and Neil Patrick Harris. And I was like, one, Elton John was on so much cocaine and doing drag in the 70s. Yeah. And like Neil Patrick Harris is a horrible piece of shit.
Also, have you ever seen the video for I'm Still Standing? Like, yes. Come on. Like,
but right. Like these people, and like it's terrible to think about, say someone like Freddie Mercury who like, or even people like George Michael who had to live the majority of their lives in the closet. Like if the video for I Want to Break Free came out now, you would have some like gammon-faced loser from like Newcastle or from Luton like literally giving himself a hemorrhoid and a brain aneurysm at the same time. It's like, they're groomers. They're coming for our kids.
For Joe, I don't know if you remember this, but for listeners who aren't familiar, in I want to say it was 87, Queen put out the great fucking song called I Want to Break Free. And in the video, it's sort of like it looks like it's shot kind of like hazy version of might be like EastEnders or some kind of sort of like, working class row house family.
Yes, I did
and
see
every
that.
single member of the band is playing every member of this family and they're all in drag.
Yeah.
It's like Freddie Mercury in drag, vacuuming and, Brian May knitting, like looking like the grandma, also in drag. Everyone's in drag. And that's also a weird thing too, is just the British, I've made this joke so many times before, but there was an episode of King of the Hill where Peggy tells Bobby to watch British comedy because it's more sophisticated. So he might not get the jokes because their sense of humor is more sophisticated. And Bobby just says, "Why is that man wearing a dress?" And it's like, but that is, I mean,
Bobby Hill just grows up to be Tim Armstrong from Rancid.
but like, please tell me Tim Armstrong's not fucking.
No, he's not. He's not. He's just like a Teaboo. I'm going to see Rancid tomorrow night, but
hell yeah, maybe he'll bring Dave Courtney on stage.
Fuck yeah.
But like on a kind of like serious note, like I remember like being a kid and like feeling the way I did and like knowing that like, okay, this is who I am, and like not really having like anyone to talk to about it, like even being too scared to like look stuff up on the internet. And it was only really like when I was in my 20s that I kind of accepted it and came out to my friends and like it kind of, when I think I try not to think about it too much, but I do, is like it just kind of breaks my heart like thinking about like kids, teenagers, people in their early 20s, fucking people at any stage of life, like feeling that they cannot be who they are, and not necessarily like, oh, people say that I am this person, but like I know it in my heart of hearts, this is who I am, and they can't actually live their life as the person they actually are. And the fear of not just, like I won't be accepted, but the fear of like actual violence. Like I remember the first time I ever got hate crimed, like, and it's a terrible thing, but like I hate to think about like someone who is my age now that I was then, and like just the fact that it would happen, and like the police aren't going to do anything, like you're not going to get any general support from the public because they're going to be like, well, you were gay and like you were walking around, or you were trans,
right,
or you're like something that isn't in the acceptable terms of the public eye, and your life is at stake just for existing.
Similarly, I can recall that it felt like the only publicly identified bisexual in the 2000s, the early 2000s, was Alan Cumming, the guy who played Boris in fucking 007 for Americans, because he's not as famous in America as he is in Britain. But also, I think, the first time I've mercifully only been hate crimed once, and it was when I was in the army. I was seeing a guy when I was visiting Berlin, and we got chased by some dudes who looked like they wanted to beat our ass, and we because we had been holding hands, and we ran to the fucking U-Bahn and got out of there. But like,
oh mein Gott, it is und gay boys.
Es ist die Schwulis, was ist los hier? Yeah, I just said yeah like I was going to speak German. it's very funny too, because when we do the comic German accent, we basically talk in like the campus German accent possible. So you're basically implying that there's a skinhead gang of incredibly gay Germans who also are homophobic. I guess that's just the Nazis.
That's just Germans.
No, funnily enough, like, so obviously, people who know me from Lions and this show, my own show, Beneath the Skin, we actually, like, we've talked about doing an episode about, there's this very famous gay neo-Nazi skinhead from the 80s in London who was a bouncer who, like, was part of the National Front and, like, was involved in, like, hate criming black gay skinheads in clubs. And it's like, these people have always kind of been around.
Right.
I didn't know that Stephen Patrick Morrissey had a different life.
So, it was funny, no, just on the Morrissey thing before we move on, it was funny, I was talking to someone about the Smiths and everything, and they were like, oh, you know, shame Morrissey is, you know, like, kind of racist now. And I'm like, Morrissey's always been like that.
Been racist. I mean, it was funny, I was talking about this because my wife really likes the song How Soon Is Now, but basically no other Smiths songs. And I was joking with her, like, it's just very, very funny because when you listen, I love the Smiths despite Morrissey being a fucking piece of shit. And if you know anything about what he's talking about, the references being made, you go back and listen to the lyrics, like, it's always been there. But it's very funny because, like, explaining to her the sort of dichotomy with the Smiths, where the opener on The Queen is Dead, the title track, is a fucking incredible song, and such as, like, it's long and it's such a badass song, and then it finally fades out at the end and it goes bum bum, frankly Mr. Shankly, I'm a sickening wreck. You're like, what the fuck is this band? It's like, it's Morrissey. But I want to say this really fast. So, like, the reason, the thing is that I got beaten up by one of my roommates. He had overheard a conversation I was having with a gay friend of mine on the phone, and he confronted me and we talked, and, like, we talked about this later. Like, he apologized to me, but basically he got drunk one night. He basically got thrown out of a house party on post with some neighbors and came in and tried to, like, get mad at me about it. And I was like, dude, it's 3 a.m, get the fuck out of my room. And he jumped in my bed and just started pummeling the fuck out of me and was like, basically, F slurs like, you don't belong in the army. Like you better get your fucking mind right before I sort it out for you. And then the next day I just realized in his bedroom, there's just a bunch of guns with magazines in the wells, and there weren't any rounds in the chamber, but, like, he wasn't supposed to have those on post.
Of course you're not.
Of course not. And he was supposed to have ammo, and all that was illegal. But, like, what was, like, here's the thing. This guy, maybe he went back to his room and he thought about killing me, but he didn't, thankfully. But here's the problem. We lived on post, and this was pre the repeal of Don't Ask, Don't Tell, so I couldn't tell anyone. The authorities. I couldn't go to the MPs. I couldn't say, hey, this guy's got guns and he beat my ass, because when the story comes out, well, why'd he beat your ass? That's going to happen. Like, the possibility existed of, like, me then getting fucking outed and kicked out. And at the time, like, I wanted to be in the army, like, for better or worse. Like, I was an idiot, but I wanted to be in the army. So it was like, the problem there wasn't, like, the aggressor is the fucking cause here, but the real problem was the institution basically saying the only way you're allowed to exist is by not acknowledging that you exist, because then there's zero protection for you. So that's why this shit, like, no matter what people say about, like, fucking, oh, if they were only less flamboyant, it's like, it doesn't fucking matter. At the end of the day, if you aren't seen as an equal citizen, if you aren't seen as, and this, I realize this is a liberal argument, but if you aren't seen equally under the law and you aren't afforded those protections, then fundamentally you are always primed to be victimized and have no recourse for it.
Not to mention, if you are creating a society where the state broadcaster is very obviously pushing a kind of propaganda to make people terrified of you, if you're passing laws that effectively criminalize your very existence, and the acknowledgement of said existence by you is confronted by the implicit or literal physical violence of the state, and your existence is, shunned by both law, media, and then in turn people, you're creating an atmosphere that does not allow for this category of person to live in an environment that is conducive for their existence. And I can think of a word that encompasses that very well. And, like, you see it in the United States as well, not at the federal level quite yet. Maybe that'll change in a couple of years. But you see it at the state level in the South, particularly, where being trans is criminalized to a certain extent.
Yeah, and basically using the thin end of the wedge being protect the children, They're basically going to force detransition on all trans people, regardless of age.
Yes, and that is, I can only imagine the incredible amount of harm that is going to cause people and has and continue and will get worse because the federal government is unwilling to get involved. And this is the crawl phase of what will eventually come, because when these laws are passed and these institutions are allowed to do what they do, you have the backing of state media to push disinformation and other kind of narratives that paint trans and gay people, as especially in the United States right now, as groomers, as pedophiles, as classifying them as being like incredibly mentally unwell. And in the UK, you're framing someone's gender identity as the same as child abuse when it comes to mandatory reporting. They know exactly what they're doing.
And like the thing, like two things that like make me so angry about this, and like particularly like with the US stuff, is like you have all these people calling them groomers. Meanwhile, people like Matt Walsh are saying like, oh, if you get a woman pregnant after 16, oh, she's no good. Like she's not going to produce good progeny. And it's like, what are you going to do? But like also on the other hand, is like, yes, there is the slow creep of state violence in a direct and also in an informal sense. And in the UK, they have literally taken away our tools to fight against it. You can't do mass protests. You can't do collective action because it's all criminalized. And at the end of the day, if it gets to a point where the state is going to criminalize our existence, then all you have is criminal means to fight back.
I don't disagree. I mean, there was a very good quote by the man who used to run Doctors Without Borders, and says you can't stop a genocide with doctors. You have the same kind of things being done in many southern states that happen to be passing these, trans panic laws and gay panic laws, like we're in the fucking 80s again, where you mass protests, you'll absolutely be arrested. They've effectively legalized being run down with cars in a lot of situations. A school in supposed liberal paradise of California can't read a book that acknowledges that a character has two fathers without there being street violence by paramilitaries.
And just since the two of you have your own areas of expertise, in mine, if you are going to mass demonstrations about this sort of stuff, make sure to cover up your tattoos, because they can be used as legal evidence against you in a court of law as an identifying factor. So cover your face, cover your hands, so on and so forth.
Don't bring your phone to a protest, even if it's off.
Yes.
I would also say don't wear any piercings, because cops love ripping that shit out.
Yep.
And if you do have to bring your phone, make sure to disable any biometric logins, so it can't use your face or your fingerprints by force.
Yeah, because cops also like doing that. I don't know. I look at this stuff and just think, like, I don't want it to be like doomerism, you know what I mean? But I just want to say that, because we're talking about this from the perspective of people who, like, I'm not directly affected by anti-trans legislation as a person, as an individual, but people that I love and care about are, and so it fucking drives me nuts. And I think the thing about it is that I don't want people to come away from this discussion and be like, well, there's no hope for anything ever. I think the point we're trying to make, though, is that, like, there isn't any point to accommodation, because this is not an ideology, a mentality, a thought process that will stop at accommodation. If anything, accommodation just emboldens it, because it creates the false sense of there being unanimous consent when there's actually not. I mean, in a way, the fact that at least half of British people, in terms of recent polling, and it's obviously inexact and it's one poll, but like even in that one sample, the fact that half of people were sympathetic to trans people, given the tenor of the discussion in this country, fuck's sake, I mean, that shows that not everyone is, uniformly propagandized. It's just that, but the problem is that any kind of concession to the sort of like, call it a politics of decency and politeness, and saying like, oh, well, actually we have to hear them out. It's like, no, you don't have to fucking hear them out, because what they want is to waste your time, and what they want is to use all of those reasonable airing out of ideas fucking forums to find fellow travelers to add to their ranks.
Yeah, the appeal to fear, this, you need to hear both sides of the fucking story type shit is literally only going to hurt the people that already don't have a voice.
Mm-hmm. And I think maybe, like, I kind of want to say this as like a closing point for anyone who might be listening to this, who is affected by this stuff, or, like, you might be out, you might not be out. living your life as who you are, and I suppose, quote unquote, living your truth is way more worth it than living a life of fear and being, like living your life in the closet and living it in secret and denying who you are, because at the end of the day, you have one life and it's up to you to choose how to live it, and living a life in defiance of that fear, and just to know as well that you're not alone either. Like, there's other people both like you and other people who'll stand by your side. That's what whenever I have this conversation on a podcast, that's what I always try and end it with, is because we can often talk about this stuff in the abstract in terms of like state legislation and state violence, and at the end of the day, there'll probably be someone listening who is, subject to it either directly or indirectly, and is scared and doesn't know whether they want to come out and live their life authentically as who they are, or to let the fear of, violence the potential for, violence and harms keep them in the closet, because at the end of the day, that's what they want. That's what they want you to feel, and that's what they want you to think, and it's what they want you to do. They want you to be scared and to hide, so they don't have to look at you, don't have to acknowledge you, and your existence, you exist in defiance of what they want.
And it's something you should be proud of about yourself.
100%.
At the end of the
Happy
day,
pride.
Yeah, I mean, at the end of the day, look, I'm always uncomfortable about sort of being publicly out, not because I'm worried about being in the closet, but more in the sense that I don't necessarily know if my experience is the most indicative. I'm openly bisexual, but I've been I'm a cis man married to a cis woman in a monogamous relationship, we've been together for almost 8 years now. So, maybe I'm not the best example, but when I was younger, I was really, I think I would have wanted to hear those voices out there in a way, just being like, yeah, you can live your life, as long as you're not harming people, as long as you're not fucking being a piece of shit, you can live this way and not have to be afraid or ashamed or feel as though you have to apologize for it. And I think that in a way, it seems even less hopeful now than it did back during the Bush era. And so I just hope that people listen to this if they're in that. I mean, granted, our demographics probably our age or older, but quite frankly, on this podcast, but maybe someone who might need to hear this will hear this, and I hope so, because frankly, you're not alone, and also you may be surrounded by people who really either buy into it or oh, let's hear it out, kind of fucking wishy-washy shit about it. And we're saying, no, you don't have to. Fuck that. Ignore it. It's bullshit. We'll fight against it with you.
And it's also a point to make. You're never too old to be who you are, because there's plenty of people who come out and they're 30s, 40s, 50s and older. Be who you are regardless of what age you are.
Yeah. Well, this has been the Pride edition of What L Would I / Lines by Donkey / alternate zoo crew.
The A in LGBTQIA+ stands for Armenian.
Oh God, now we're getting canceled for asexual erasure. God damn it, Tom. All right. Guys, we'll plug our shows, I suppose. Please listen to Lines by Donkeys, because you probably recognize all these voices, and also Kill James Bond, a podcast by 3 trans co-hosts who are extremely funny, making fun of movies. I recorded an episode as a guest of Rambo 3 with them. It was a lot of fun. I'll listen to that show. It's great. Listen to Trash Future, a podcast about how the tech industry is awesome and definitely is going to solve our problems. And then the rest of y'all have shows. Well, Joe's got one that I already plugged. Yeah,
I will say, if you're looking for a welcoming space to be yourself, check out our Discord.
Yeah, it's actually really good. It's the combined one for Hell of a Way and Lions, and it's extremely queer positive in every possible way. So I think you'll enjoy it if as long as you're not a right-wing skinhead alternate universe Stephen Patrick Morrissey.
And then you'll be banned within 5 seconds.
Pretty much, yeah.
You get to see pictures of me drinking pints. And yeah, listen to Beneath the Skin, the show about the history of everything told through the history of tattooing. And listen to everything else that Nate mentioned that I am tangentially involved with in one way or another.
I don't have anything to plug. You already plugged my show.
Yeah, I think that's good. All right, so all right, everyone, thanks so much for listening. If you like this show, there's way more on the Patreon. $5 a month gets you everything. And if not, we will talk to you next week. Bye.